A group of 90-year-olds in Boca Raton, a familiar place to many of you, including our bat mitzvah girl on winter breaks. So a group of 90-year-olds in Boca Raton were sitting around talking about their ailments. "My arms are so weak I can hardly hold this cup of coffee," said one. "Yes, I know. My cataracts are so bad I can't even see my coffee," said another. "It has gotten to where I cannot hear anything anymore," said one in the loudest voice of the group. "I can't turn my head because of the arthritis in my neck," said a third, to which several nodded weakly in agreement. "I guess that's the price we pay for being in our 90s, winced an old man as he shook his head. Then there was a short moment of silence. "Well, it's not that bad," said one woman cheerfully. "Thank God we can all still drive." My dear friends, while there comes a time when we can't drive, hopefully there will never come a time when we can't laugh. This week's Torah portion in Genesis 18, Vayera, means "and God appeared," referring to God's appearance to Abraham when the first Jew was recuperating from his circumcision. Visitors stop by, and Abraham and Sarah show them southern hospitality. Then the visitors predict that in a year, Sarah, age 90, will give birth to a son. Sarah laughs, unable to imagine that a couple their age could ever give birth to a child. But when the child is born, he is named Isaac, from the Hebrew root for laughter. 3 chapters later, the Torah will say, "Ve'Avraham ben ma'at shana b'hivaled." Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. And Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this story will laugh with me." What's clear in the Torah is that starting this week with Isaac, the age of laughter begins. Judaism doesn't believe that religion is off limits to humor. If God can help us bear our tragedies, God can also take our humor. After all, God must have a sense of humor. Just look at us and the rest of God's creation. If our minds and hearts are gifts from God, then so too is the sense of humor God has planted within each of us. That's why Purim is such a Jewish holiday. God is the creator of healthy laughter, not laughter that mocks others or makes fun of others. When the rabbis of the Mishnah say little but do much, v'hevei mekabel kol ha'adam b'sever panim yafot, receive all people with a smile and joyful face, the early rabbis were not speaking of jokers or jesters. They were speaking of people at school or work, people on the street, the folks you meet before and after services, whose faces bear a smile instead of a scowl, who greet you with joy and not a frown, who get you breathing fully by laughing with a joyous remark, pleasant grin, healthy laugh, or a beaming face. Laughter is healing, isn't it? It doesn't diminish even when a loved one dies. As Elie Wiesel put it so well, and I quote, "Every death leaves a scar, and every time a child laughs, that scar begins to heal." I just returned from leading a select group of Memphis leaders through a week of intensive experiences in Israel, not your usual trip. Planned meetings with Tikkun Olam change agents in Israeli society, from Israeli doctors who are saving lives from around the world to young Israeli millennials who are rescuing Syrian refugees, victims of earthquakes, tsunamis, even hurricanes in this part of the world. I took them to meet with Nadia in the north, where women are helping Jews and Arabs create a totally different society than one of separation and segregation by improving and empowering women and their families. For coexistence to be real, whether in Israel or America, each ethnicity, religion, and race has to want to come closer to the other and not just talk. That's why I even took them to meet with Palestinian leaders in Ramallah who want peace with Israel and whose 180,000 modern Palestinian residents want the same thing Israelis on the other side of the wall want, to live. And when we returned from Ramallah, we met the same day with more heroes, like Rabbi Noah Sata, who directs the Israel Religious Action Center, Iraq, whose founder, Anat Hoffman, you may know from her fight for women at the Western Wall to be able to say prayers and read from the Torah like Sadie Sims will do tomorrow. Only Anat and Noah were arrested by the rabbinic police for doing so. Iraq defends the dignity of any Israeli, including ultra-Orthodox women who've been silenced by male rabbis, gay people who've been discriminated against by the chief rabbinate. And while we were there this week, their lawyers took on the chief rabbi of Tzfat in the Supreme Court for excommunicating and punishing any Jew who rents an apartment to a non-Jew. There was the heroic youth village leader, Racheli, who fled Ethiopia on foot at age 5 and literally walked 2 weeks to Sudan before being airlifted to Israel to join 130,000 Ethiopian Jews living in Israel. She's now a mother of 4 and directs outreach for at-risk Israeli youth. Just one more of many other amazing heroes I scheduled time with was Reli Schwartz-Sur, the Israeli-Russian woman who directs Yad L'Kashish, Lifeline for the Old, a place that empowers elderly Israeli immigrants with dignity and respect based on the Torah's teaching, Al tashlicheni la'et zikna, do not abandon me when I'm older in my life. The kippah I wear was hand-knitted by people at Yad L'Kashish like Yosef, who's still making fine crafts into his late 80s, and Monir. She had a husband who was going to be killed by the Iranian regime, so they escaped, and they literally walked from Iran to Israel. Why am I sharing these heroes I brought our Memphis leaders to meet with? What did they share in common beyond their selfless personalities? It's a remarkable attitude in response to the challenges their constituents are facing, not only in Israel, but here in America and around the world. Attitude. When you study Zionism and Israel, the most famous poet in Israel history, Rachel, is always mentioned. She and her generation drained the malaria-infested marshes above the Sea of Galilee as part of the second Aliyah after 1903. And that generation, they pioneered the land. They had a rude awakening coming from where my relatives did, Eastern Europe, where it was cold. They had to deal with the summer heat, rocky terrain, malaria, border dangers. They were the ones who established the first kibbutz in Israel. If all the lights were turned off in Israel in the 1920s, except for those kibbutzes in the north, you would literally see the map of Israel, the future map. She and the young pioneers who created their first kibbutz, Dagania, in 1909, they're hailed as heroes. But here's my point of tonight's sermon. Listen to what she said in 1925, looking back on her life and helping plant seeds for the Jewish state before her untimely death at age 40. She said, "We were not heroes. We were not martyrs. We dared to be happy. Through it all, we dared to laugh. We dared to be happy." When we read the Torah this week, we learn that God was impressed by the first human laughter and decided to immortalize it in the name of Sarah's future son, Isaac, Yitzchak, meaning he will laugh. Like Rachel and all the unsung stars in Israel, all the unsung heroes in Memphis, like all our Jewish families' forefathers and foremothers, may we see them less as heroes and more as doers who dared to be happy. Less as heroes and more as doers who dare to be happy. And may we become more like them. May we all become doers who dare to be happy. And let us say, Amen.